My friends, once again, we welcome here to the Holy Spirit Chapel members of the ELMS College community, particularly the members of the diaconate class of 2021 and students in our own Master of Arts in Applied Theology program. Most of us know people who like to ask a lot of questions. And most of us know people who like to answer questions with questions. When we read the first reading of today, we realize that Moses was one of those people who liked to do both. Moses liked to ask questions, and Moses often answered questions asked of him by posing even more questions himself. When God calls Moses in today's first reading, Moses answers with two questions. Who are you, and where should I go? Notice that it is Moses being called by God himself, and yet each time God calls him, Moses dares to answer with a question. Moses asks other questions like this. What if the people to whom you send me don't believe in me? Don't you have somebody better than I to send? We see that God eventually becomes tired of all the questions and emphatically responds, I want you, Moses, and nobody else. From this brief encounter in the reading, a couple of lessons emerge. First, questions in and of themselves are good and an important part of life and learning. But as in the case of Moses, questions can sometimes be our way of stalling, of buying time, or simply passing the buck. And as in the case of Moses, questions are sometimes indicative of our own insecurity and even poor self-image. And the second lesson we learn is this. God knows who we are, with all of our strengths and all of our weaknesses. He knows these things long before he calls us. God knew what Moses would be good at and even what Moses would struggle with long before he was called to lead God's people. Yet God called Moses just as he was, and in a very similar way, God calls each of us and loves us just as we are. Some things we do need to question. Blind faith is never a good thing. But as we learn from Moses, God's unconditional love for us and the unqualified invitation to be part of his greater plan for the good of all his people, we need never question. This week's Chalice feature invites us to consider the work of Guest House, a treatment for clergy and religious living with addictive disorders. Since its founding in 1956, Guest House had treated more than 7,000 priests and deacons and seminarians, along with religious sisters and brothers from throughout the United States and beyond. Although men and women referred to Guest House for treatment usually arrive at the doors, questioning God like Moses and even their vocation, the overarching majority, again like Moses, eventually hear God's voice during their time in treatment, assuring them of his unconditional love and invitation to become an even greater part of God's plan for the good of his people. A very wise person once suggested that we should never put a question mark where God has put a period. The good news today is this. God calls each of us, even in our weakness, and for some of us, the weakness of addiction, to be a part of God's greater plan for the good of all his people.